Murder on the Dance Floor. Now, at this time of year, no matter how hard you fight it, the eventual conclusion is forced upon you by innumerable advertising messages assaulting you from all sides. Wherever you look, whatever you listen to, even in the conversation in the pub where you've tried to escape them. Christmas is coming. And with it, the season of parties of various shapes and sizes, hopefully many of them avoidable. But even with the best odds, there's a dreadful inevitability to the fact that there will come a moment when I will be forced to get up and dance. AKA, in my case, murder on the dance floor. Now that's not just a disco banger sublimely rendered by Sophie Ellis-Bextor and given a notable retread by Royal Otis a decade or so later. It's also a very accurate description of me and my dad dancing. Which is why I take refuge in my musical capabilities and try to stay on the stage, creating the music rather than inflicting my moves on fellow dancers on the floor. Playing in the band keeps me out of trouble. Now, don't get me wrong, dance is something I appreciate, but as a spectator. I can try to reverse engineer a little of the craft and appreciate it all the more, because from my observation deck up on the stage, I can see what actually goes in, which is a little more than just random jerking of limbs in approximate time to the beat. In particular, dancers practice dance routines, patterns of steps which they experiment with and gradually routinize to the point where a choreographer can actually codify them, capture them, share them with others. It's a learned pattern of behavior. Now, you can see this in the basics. A waltz has its origins as a repeatable and learnable pattern. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, turning while you do it. The difference between these basic steps and the elaborate spectacle of a full-scale Viennese ball is a mixture of practice and then elaboration. Plus, in that context, some pretty fancy evening gowns and white ties and tails. But it's the same with any dance, from the old staples handed down over centuries to newer variants, from arabesque through to Zumba dancing. It's all about patterns and practice. And new dances continue to emerge, in part in response to new musical styles and possibilities, in part through new dance ideas. So there's a constant process of experimenting and co-evolution of new routines to deal with a changing musical environment. Think about the shocking impact at the time of dances like the Charleston or the Twist, and map their emergence onto a social and musical context which was trying to break free of stuffy old traditions, create and live out something new. Now, all of this connects neatly with the idea of innovation, because dance gives us a great metaphor for the process of creating value from ideas. The basic challenge remains the same, but the ways in which we do it evolve and develop over time in a constantly changing context. New technologies, new markets, new rules of the game, they all combine to drive new ways of getting that value creation job done. Now, any organisation might get lucky once, somehow stumble around its innovation equivalent of the dance floor. But to repeat the trick and to continue to do so over time requires developing routines, practicing and enhancing them. And just like those great dancers, those underlying routines are not accidents. They're refined and rehearsed to the point of becoming the way we do things around here. Now, the International Standards Organization, the ISO, might be able to now specify what an organization should be doing in its innovation management system with the guidelines contained in ISO 56002. But success on the real dance floor of innovation practice is going to depend on how well an organization can articulate and embed routines, shared behavior patterns for doing so. How do we search for opportunities? How do we choose effectively which projects to back? How do we manage the process of creating concepts, developing prototypes, engaging with our markets, hearing the voice of the customers? We've got a lot of dance steps to learn. Plus, innovation is all about dancing with uncertainty as your partner. The music, the external environment, is fast-paced, accelerating, and increasingly a mashup of different genres, designed to knock you off your best moves just when you're throwing a great shape. So working on your routines is an essential task, and an uphill one. Routines can't remain static. They need reviewing and refreshing, and from time to time, replacing completely. We need the capability to dance, our routines, and then that meta capability of stepping back, reviewing, and maybe changing them. Dynamic capability. Now we can see this pattern everywhere we look, and it helps to explain long-term innovation success. Take an organization like 3M, positively geriatric in calendar years, 123 years old and counting, but still capable of delivering a steady stream of breakthrough innovations and growth possibilities built on the principle of achieving 1/3 of their sales from products developed over the previous 3 years. Now that kind of innovation dancing depends on some pretty nifty routines, which are simultaneously deeply embedded into their culture, but also constantly reviewed and upgraded, adapted or replaced. Or look at Procter & Gamble, another sprightly centenarian, this one 188 years old and counting, which spent its first century or so building and extending routines around its own technical and market research and development. But in 1999, it recognized the shifting external landscape and the explosion of knowledge-based opportunities, things it was missing out on. And it began the process of reconfiguring its routines wholesale. Their target was to move from doing all their innovation in-house to finding new routines to enable it to source 50% of its innovation, half of it, from outside. Now that's been a long and continuing journey, but it has helped the organization reposition itself and continue to grow through innovation. FieldReady is a somewhat younger and less well-known organization, operating in a very different space. Born in 2013 out of concern for how to respond in the face of humanitarian disasters. And it hit on the idea of using 3D printing technology to help replace broken but critical equipment such as pumps or hospital devices. It worked, and it offered exciting possibilities in terms of getting aid to disaster-hit areas quickly. But it also involved a lot of learning and the construction of new routines to make their innovation model work. Their vision was to change the way aid was delivered by moving from a supply chain approach to one of localized aid, moving the technology, 3D printing, to where it could actually deliver local solutions quickly. They began working in disaster zones like Haiti and Nepal after devastating hurricanes and earthquakes, and quickly learned that their technological fix needed a lot more around it to realize the vision. Local communities could be empowered, but skills were in short supply. Designs could be quickly printed where they were needed, but that relied on having access to design libraries or designers able to provide the information. So FieldReady have spent the last decade learning and extending their routines to make the model work at a systems level, partnering with local businesses, governments, community groups, rather than just transferring capacity after a crisis. They've moved from an approach which delivered externally generated solutions to one which is based much more on co-creating solutions with end users in affected communities, making sure they are appropriate and they address local needs. For example, developing water filters in Colombia or creating insulation from recycled plastics in Turkey. So their original high-tech model has been augmented with local skills, drawing in low-tech, woodworking, sewing, using local waste materials. So using these low-tech solutions, matching local capabilities and resources to their high-tech. That resulting approach is a much more robust model, delivering capability not only to adapt to acute crises, but also providing capacity and resource building to help with longer-term recovery. So their approach does work. It shifts away from the traditional supply chain model, and in doing so, they can reduce the time to deliver aid from weeks to hours, while also reducing costs by as much as 90%. They offer customized solutions which fit local needs rather than deploying a one-size-fits-all approach. A good example of their work was during COVID, when they were able to create a locally accepted challenge to a culture in which frequent hand washing wasn't being prioritized. They developed a 3D printed toy which could be embedded in a bar of soap and which helped encourage children to wash their hands in order to access the toy inside. And Field Ready reduced the dependency of vulnerable communities by empowering them, providing skills, training and resources. For example, setting up local makerspaces and innovation labs to produce their own supplies, and in that way build long-term resilience and enable economic growth. Or take Translators Without Borders, another organisation working in the humanitarian aid space, deploying an approach similar to that of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, but with translation services instead of healthcare at their core. Now, in any disaster, natural or man-made, delivery of solutions depends in large measure on being able to communicate with people on the ground, victims and helpers. Critical information needs to be passed on quickly and accurately, yet there's often a significant language barrier between the supply side of aid workers and the demand side of recipients. And mainstream languages like English or Spanish may not be useful. Communication often involves a long tail of languages and dialects which need translation quickly and at the point of need. The Translators Without Borders core idea was to mobilize a network of volunteers with these capabilities and find ways of connecting them rapidly, either in person or on online platforms. It was set up originally in 1993 as Traducteurs Sans Frontières by Laurie Thick and Ros Smyth-Thomas, and it expanded in 2010 into Translators Without Borders. It now has over 100,000 volunteers in its network. But just as with Field Ready, their original model has changed, reflecting new routines inside the organisation. In this case, the early model created by the founders built on in-person services, much like MSF operates today, putting people on the ground. But technology began to open up significant opportunities, not least to enable a crowdsourcing platform approach to the problem. And this was the impetus behind developments in 2011. By collaborating with Pros.com, which is an online agency for freelance translators, TWB created a workspace where translators could volunteer their services for humanitarian aid projects. In its first year of operation, it delivered 2.5 million words of translation. By 2015, it had delivered 7 million translated words through 780 projects to 214 aid organizations. Moving to this crowdsourced model had a big impact on translation speed. Under the original manual system, they translated 29 projects with 37,000 words of text in 7 language pairs for 9 different organizations. By 2012, 7 months after they moved to their workspace model, they translated 183 projects, 280,000 words, 25 language pairs, 24 organizations. In 2017, TWB began using machine translation technology and translation memory systems, leading to the launch of an enhanced platform. This was named Cato, and it's continued to add and augment the range of support available to actors in the humanitarian field, and to strengthen the translator community by offering their services in a more efficient fashion. The core idea remains the same, but the means through which their service is delivered is constantly changing as they innovate with new offerings. But their capacity to do this depends on adapting their routines in the context of opportunities, in this case, like emerging technologies, as well as dealing with unexpected challenges. Now, the humanitarian world is perhaps an extreme case. Living with uncertainty is the norm there, and operation conditions are never steady state. It's always crisis-driven. But the principle applies to any organisation. Innovation needs routines to help repeat the trick, but it also needs that ability to step back and revise those routines. When the band starts playing an unexpected new tune, it's important to be able to move your feet in different ways.